Trade tensions are again rising between the United States and Europe, this time over airplanes. The U.S. is accusing the European Union of unfair subsidies and is threatening tariffs on $11 billion worth of goods, ranging from Airbus jets to cheese to wine. So can the two sides avoid a trade war? And how should they address their disputes? To discuss this and more, I'm happy to be joined in our studio by Professor John Gong from the University of International Business and Economics, Einar Tangen, current affairs commentator. Via satellite in Brussels, we also have Daniel Gross, director of the Center for European Policy Studies, and in Amsterdam, Professor Steve King from Kingston University. That is our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Jonathan Betts. So this is an interesting topic because this trade dispute between Europe and the United States has been going on now for months, well over a year. It's taking a new dimension here with the concerns over Airbus. So, Einar, let me start with you. The U.S. is threatening tariffs on billions of dollars worth of European goods. How serious is that threat?
Well, the issue is not the seriousness. 11 billion sounds like a huge number, but it's a small drop in the bucket in terms of the overall trade between the U.S. and Europe. But it's signaling once again the saber rattling by the Trump administration that they want to kind of push the EU. What's surprising about this is they have not settled their deal with China yet, and yet they're pushing out on a new front. It seems that almost every day Donald Trump wants to make sure that everybody knows that he's willing to take on all comers.
Do you think that the concerns from the United States, though, are valid?
In terms of this particular news, no, absolutely not. Neither side has clean hands when it comes to this issue about who is subsidizing who. Hundreds of billions of dollars have been poured in both sides. Both sides use them for their defense spending as well as things. So when you start adding up all of the tax things that have been poured into Boeing, all the ones that have been poured into Airbus, it's just silly. There's a great cartoon that was in there, and it showed these two, claiming falsely that, oh, you're being subsidized. Oh, but you're being subsidized. It's a childish.
But the World Trade Organization, John, has ruled in the United States' favor when it comes to this particular issue and Airbus, saying that Airbus has been getting illegal subsidies from the European Union and has cleared the United States of other accusations when it comes to subsidizing Boeing. So does Donald Trump here have a point?
I think the Trump administration really does have a point. But the timing of this thing is suspicious to me because, what happened is that there's a ruling from the dispute resolution panel in the WTO saying that the U.S. has a point here and the European Union is supposed to rectify it. The European Union said that we did rectify, but the United States is not up to its obligation. So they're waiting for an arbitration. Well, before waiting for the result of arbitration coming out, the U.S. still is taking action, okay? And I think what's even more suspicious is with respect to the substance of this dispute. The dispute is with respect to Airbus 380 and also Airbus 350 actual wide airplane, yeah, that's right. But the 380 is already discontinued, actually, right? And the 350 extra wide body, actually, it's actually, in my opinion, it's not very competitive with the Boeing 787. If you look at the total numbers of deliveries of 350, it's not a big deal, in my opinion. So, why would you actually initiate an action against 350 and also stuffed in with a whole basket of other products, agricultural products? It's just beyond my understanding.
I mean, 6 months from now, when the ruling comes out, or whenever it does, there is going to be some accusations leveled against the U.S. I think, I still go back to my original position. Both of them have been getting subsidies and will continue to get subsidies because it's national interest. There's a reason there's only 2 airplane makers in the world.
Well, one is already discontinued. I mean, the question is actually going away.
But there's also the issue.
Well, let me bring in Daniel in Brussels here, because I definitely want to get the European reaction to all this. I mean, Daniel, how concerned do you think European economies are that Trump may make good on these tariff claims and might escalate this trade war?
Now, one has really to distinguish between this Boeing Airbus story and the car story. The Boeing Airbus story has been going on for 20 years, even long before Trump. I would say that's a good old, not really war, it's a skirmish between two friends. As my colleague in Beijing just said, both sides are subsidizing, both sides go to the WTO, and both sides win one half, gain, lose one half, and then there's a little bit of tit for tat, but that is not really something serious overall. The car story would be different if it were to come, because that would be an entirely new front. It would be much, much bigger, hundreds of billions potentially, and there would be really no fundamental cause for it. And therefore, I would say, for the time being, on the Boeing Airbus front, Europe is quite relaxed. On the car front, nobody knows what is going to happen.
So explain to us why that is such a sensitive issue for Europe. You talked about these car tariffs here, 25% threatened by President Trump. What would that mean for economies in Europe, especially Germany?
Of course, car is a major export product, not only of Germany, because many cars are made in Germany, but in reality they're made in Europe, because Germany sources many components from its neighboring countries. And the car industry is central. It occupies many more than Airbus does. And most of all, it is something where there's no really reason to do anything. Everybody agrees airplane manufacturers is a highly politicized game with lots of subsidies on both sides. So you involve a little bit of saber rattling with the WTO just to keep things in check. But on cars, that was always considered a totally clean sector. And then when Trump says this is national security, this would mean that he could do anything. So that is really why the car industry and any tariff on cars would be quite a different story.
So let me also bring in Professor Steve Keen in Amsterdam. So Professor Keen here, when you look at this trading relationship between the European Union and the United States, it's $1 trillion worth of goods exchanged back and forth. But the United States buys a lot more from Europe than Europe buys from the United States. The EU's promised retaliatory tariffs, but how much leverage does Europe really have in these trade tensions?
It really only has a choice to retaliate. I don't think it doesn't have any bargaining power in that sense, and particularly with Trump. So I can just see this being a sign that what's really lying behind this is that globalization was sold as something which would make everybody better off, including the American working class, and it hasn't. They're voting for Trump, and he is very skillfully exploiting their anger. And he will keep on doing this. The Europeans have no choice but, I think, to retaliate.
And how do you think they will retaliate other than tariffs? Are there other avenues and options for the European Union?
That's about the only one, but I think what it's pointing out is that certainly if we're going to see another 6 years of Trump, which is quite possible, 5 years, they will be European firms making decisions about having to locate their production in America rather than trying to export to them.
What is the ultimate end game here? What do you think President Trump really wants out of all this?
Oh no, this is, don't mistake this for policy. This is really politics. And what it is him getting reelected. I mean, we've talked many times about when he's going to, sign an agreement with China, and I think it'll be when it's to his best political advantage. In terms of the EU thing, I do think there are alternatives, and frankly, Germany has 40% of its GDP dependent on outside trade. I don't know how you do that domestically, so I would disagree with my colleague on that. I think what you're going to do is start to see a shift, if there is another 5 years of Trump, a shift towards more stable markets, markets that are able to handle their situation, markets like China, where the GDP is being revised upward, where the rest of the world is being revised down.
Well, let's talk about that here, because as you point out, China is eager to build bridges, and certainly with Europe. John, do you think this could be a big opportunity for China to try to grow closer with the European Union?
Oh yeah, the news that just came out yesterday. Premier Li Keqiang has reached kind of agreement with the European Union side regarding the future cooperation of defending the multilateral system. I also want to add a note about what are the options the European side has with respect to retaliating the American side. I think on the trade side, probably the European side is probably constrained because it's a lopsided trade pattern here. But on other fronts, for example, on the competition policy front, I think the Trump administration is very, very unhappy about the antitrust actions the European Union has taken with respect to the American companies. So on this side, there are very large American companies operating in Europe. In the past, there will be Microsoft. Today, there will be Google. This company has been fined billions and billions of dollars, and Trump was very, very happy about this. So on this front, I think the European side does have some leverage.
But I want to get back to the China issue here. I mean, why do you think China is so keen to build a closer relationship with the European Union?
Well, I think China is very concerned about the future direction of WTO reform. There have been proposals from the European side, there's also certainly proposals from the American side regarding the future direction of WTO reform. And China, being the largest trading nation in the world, has a very unique political and economic system that is described as somehow not very consistent with the WTO spirit. And certainly China is very concerned about the prospect of being single-handedly targeted by the combination of the European forces and American forces. So I think with this thing coming out and reach some kind of agreement with the European side from China's perspective, it helps a lot.
I would completely agree with my colleague John here, who says, look, he uses whatever is available when it's to his advantage and ignores it when it isn't. So I don't think there's going to be any change. There's no desire for him to have the U.S. submit to any authority that it does not control, and that you've seen this time after time, whether it's NATO, whether it's the Paris Convention.
Agreement, yeah.
It doesn't matter what it is. He does not feel that the U.S. or himself is answerable to anybody.
But Trump says part of his anger is because he feels like, John, the WTO is unfair, that it needs reforms. Does he not have a point somewhere in there?
I think he does have a point. I think things have changed greatly for the last several decades, but the WTO hasn't really changed. It's very slow and doesn't address the more new issues coming out of the trade, especially in service area, especially in other areas. I think he does have a point, but I think if he really respects WTO, he would have waited a little bit longer. It's only a few months later for the arbitration to come out, and on this case, he does have a point. I mean, the ruling from WTO has been all in favor of the American side on the airplane issue. So he could have waited. And if he really respects WTO, he wouldn't have stuffed in all the other products into this Section 301 investigation. Okay. So I think I mean, I think I totally agree with Einar that on certain issues that he is happy, he would adhere with WTO on issues, as you said, that he would just disagree and ignore it.
There's a lot more to talk about here. I want to continue this conversation, especially when it comes to the Airbus-Boeing rivalry, but we have to take a quick break. You're watching Dialogue on CGTN. And welcome back. You're watching Dialogue. We are discussing trade tensions between the European Union and the United States. They continue to boil over. It looks like the new topic is about Airbus. So, John, let's talk about this. President Trump is threatening tariffs on the European Union because it feels like it is unfairly subsidizing Airbus, giant airplane manufacturer. We have to talk about the timing here. This comes right after the huge crisis for Boeing. Do you feel like it's related? Yeah,
I think, of course, it's related. I think it's serving as sort of a warning sign that don't push us too hard. Boeing is having a big difficulty right now. A big difficulty. The grounding of the Boeing 737, Max 8 and 7, that's a bread and butter for Boeing. And I think it's a warning sign to the European side that Airbus shouldn't take too much advantage of pushing
Even though you just said President Trump has a point on this issue because the World Trade Organization has ruled in the U.S.'s favor.
Right. Exactly.
Oh, yeah, but let's, in 6 months from now, we'll see what the actual ruling comes out, and there will be some.
So far, at least, it's in favor, right?
So far. But this issue, the enormity of this to Boeing is huge. We're talking about 1/3 of last year's planes delivered were these Max and 87, and over half the ones that were delivered in December. Now, there's a scandal. There's all sorts of investigations going into there. I don't know if he's sending a signal. I think he's just saying, "Oh, we got to do something. We got to look tough. So I'm going to throw in some sanctions based on these outdated laws from the 301 investigations."
And Daniel, do you think that these are related? That the current talk about issuing tariffs over the Airbus issue is related to the Boeing crisis right now?
Yes, it would also be related to the overall ongoing talks between the EU and the US, because Trump wants to signal that he is tough, that when he makes threats, he's willing to follow up on them. And basically what he wants to get out of the Europeans is that they open their market more for U.S. agricultural product, because that's really the one area where Europe is still somewhat protectionist, and that would be his big prize. And the problem is, of course, on the European side that our own farmers want to be protected. So I would expect more heat, more tit for tat going on quite some time on the Atlantic front.
And Daniel, let's talk about that there, because this has been a sticking point in these trade talks between Europe and the U.S., agricultural goods, particularly in Europe. Why is that such a sticking point for European authorities?
Well, the basic point is that the Americans are much better at mass producing certain commodities, soybeans, grain, and they are using all, if you want, industrial methods, hormones to get the beef bigger and better. Whereas in Europe we have a more agriculture which looks more at quality than quantity. So on quantity it's not competitive, and therefore we have protectionism measures against grain, soybeans and some other stuff. And the Americans on the other side do not recognize our own quality standards. So it's as if two semi-deaf people were talking to each other. We are protectionist in terms of quantity. They don't really recognize quality, and that's why it's very difficult to organize a reciprocal market opening. But in the end, I hope that some reason will prevail, so the Europeans open a bit, and the Americans then are ready perhaps to recognize some of the quality standards which we have in Europe.
And do you think that is possible? I mean, you say if reason will prevail, but I mean, do you think that Europe might open up its markets a little bit more in this sector, and that there might be some wiggle room here for negotiations?
Yes, a little bit, yes, because also the European agriculture has become somewhat more competitive. And ultimately because Europe is politically very weak. We depend on the American protection. Europe is not really united, and therefore in the end on the trade front it is very likely that Europe will have to make some concessions just to keep the peace with Trump, at least in the area of trade.
So, Einar, when you look at the big relationship here between the European Union and the United States, how would you sum it up? I mean, how are things right now between these two huge heavyweights?
Well, it's changing. Obviously, a lot of the soft power allegiance has gone. You've seen leaders on both sides saying, you know, very disparaging things about each other. So, I mean, from a soft power point of view, it's gone. And from a hard power view, you know, the concern here now is that the U.S. is being a very disruptive entity. And the rest of the world is, with a few exceptions, is still devoted to multilateralism. So on that basis, what you're seeing is not only just China and the EU, but also other nations, South America, even Africa, Southeast Asia, are saying, look, if you do business and diplomacy, you need to be able to depend on things. You need to be able to trust them. You can't have agreements that you just tear up a few minutes later because they're not to your advantage. So things could isolate the U.S. Going forward, because even if you give in today, the question is, how do you feel long term? And if the Europeans feel long term that their best interests are served elsewhere, they're going to start de-emphasizing that relationship.
In long term, that is a huge concern. I mean, where do we go from here? What does this look like? What does this relationship look like in the next few years?
Yeah, I think it's a very dynamic environment, but I think overall, probably the WTO system still won't fall apart. I think, you know, with China and the European side to be engaged in defending this multilateral platform, and I think still Donald Trump isn't going to pull the plug right away. So I think, you know, this multilateral system probably is going to sustain here, but you know, it's going to be full of quarrels. It's going to be full of bickerings and disputes. So it's going to be a very dynamic environment. But I think I want to add a note about the timing of the whole thing. This is not the right time to engage in another trade war, okay? The IMF has come out to say, you know, this is not the right time. The world global economy is having difficulties right now. The WTO has come out to say the same thing. So on top of the trade war between China and the U.S., and there's another trade war between the U.S. and Europe, you know, the timing just cannot be worse than that. So I think, you know, this is not the the right time to do this.
But in the United States, few people, I think, are really tuned into the trade war here. The economy seems to be doing well by many indications here. Do you feel like there's going to be enough pressure internally to try to stop
Well,
this?
I mean, the mass and people in general don't realize that, you know, these things are going to come back and bite the economy. You know, it's not going to manifest its, you know, adverse impact right away, but after a few months, you know, things are going to get worse, and people are going to realize it before it's going to be too late. So, you know, usually the adverse impact on this trade war is not going to be felt at least for the next 10 months or so. But by the time people realize this, it's going to be already too late, and damage is already done. So I think people, the leadership in the United States should realize this. People like Lighthizer, people like Nutrien, they should realize that you know, the adverse impact is going to come back and bite the U.S. economy. So I think they should have the vision that you know, we should prevent the world from sliding into a recession here.
Well, I mean, but the United States would say, the Trump administration would say, they have very legitimate concerns here. That too long the system has been balanced out of favor of the U.S.
That I agree. That I agree.
But let me come on.
So,
but I think, you know, right now it's all talk. But I'm actually not convinced that the two sides will really engage in a trade war, really engage in imposing tariffs. I view it as more as a skirmish right now. So I'm not even convinced that the real tariffs will be imposed at all.
So, Einar, how do you push back against that? Because you hear these concerns from President Trump and his administration that it's not fair, that the U.S. is being ripped off, and that this has been going on for years here. What do you say to that?
Who controls the SWIFT system, the international monetary system? Who's been benefiting from having artificially low interest rates due to the fact that they control this thing? So this idea that this has been unfair to China, that you simply look at GDP numbers, and GDP itself is a flawed metric. We've talked about that. 30% of the things that are shipped out of China are from somewhere else, yet they're still counted against GDP.
But on aircraft issue,
yeah, you want to talk about the aircraft?
There's no aircraft. The U.S. has a point, I think.
No, they don't. Both sides subsidize. You know, I'm a lawyer. When you go into court, there's a clean hands doctrine. That means do not go into court when you're a criminal and you're accusing somebody else of doing the same thing.
There is a ruling already. There's a ruling already, and the U.S. complaint right now is that the European side claims they have ratified things, but American side says they haven't ratified enough up to the ruling. Okay, so they're waiting for the arbitration to see who is right on this.
This is right out of the schoolyard. This is, you know, oh, you did it. No, you did it. You're dumb. No, you're dumb. This is silly.
Why are you are sitting here defending the World Trade Organization, saying that we need to follow this multilateral trading system. He's making a point that that's kind of what's happening in this particular case when it comes to Airbus.
Yeah, they're following it because it's advantageous. It's an opportunistic time for Trump to invoke that. But the fact is he's not following it. He's refusing to appoint these judges. Once you get below 3 judges, there's no more enforcement organization. Now, in terms of what's wrong with the WTO, it has nothing to do with making America rich. Remember, the U.S. is the most wealthy country in the world. So this idea that somehow, poor me, I'm the richest, most powerful economically, politically, and military power on earth, don't you feel sorry for me? And that the WTO should, instead of taking care of poor people and people who are trying to rise, take care of the very, very wealthy.
If we just talk about the aircraft issue, I think historically these judges at WTO haven't been very friendly to the United States. And the fact that they came up with this ruling in favor of the U.S. says a lot, says volume about, you know, how much of a legitimate point the United States side have. So I think on this, if we only talk about an aircraft issue, the U.S. does have a point.
But we're not talking about only aircraft. He's putting it on wine and cheese.
Well, let me pull in
That I agree.
Let me pull in Daniel Gross. I mean, let me get you in on this here, because this is kind of an interesting debate here, talking about the role of the WTO in this dispute and in these trade wars. Your take?
As I said earlier, I think this is a sign that actually Trump uses the WTO. And if he uses it, maybe he will think it's better not to discard it. But also this dispute, Boeing Airbus, has been going on for 20 years, has been on and off. Sometimes the WTO rules in favor for the US, sometimes in favor of the Europeans. And as my colleague said, both sides have really subsidized their own big airplane industry. So I think this is really nothing new, and we shouldn't get too excited about it, because it will come on and off. It's just the timing, perhaps, when everybody is already so nervous. But we had Airbus wars in the past, we had chicken wars in the past. That's not new. So I would say on this front we shouldn't really be too much concerned.
Not too much concerned. I mean, we are talking about billions of dollars here. We're talking about jobs, we're talking about economies. Einar, we're running out of time. Your thoughts?
It would be nice if there were a rational world and we could actually solve these things. Unfortunately, we're dealing with somebody who is not very predictable.
John?
Oh, I think $11 billion is not a big deal in the grand scheme of things. The European U.S. trade is in the $1 trillion range, and even in terms of jobs, I think the impact on Airbus 787, which is supposed to compete with Airbus 350, they're very competitive. It's not going to cut into deep into Boeing 787's market.
But the big picture here, relationship between the United States and Europe, do you feel like it's fraying irreversibly?
No, I don't think so. I think
I
think it's just a skirmish. I think at the end of the day, they will come to a negotiating table and reach an agreement.
Einar?
I would disagree. I think that you're seeing a long-term trend where the predictability of the trade partner and your political partner are in question.
Okay, well, I'll have to leave it there. I want to thank our guests for your time today. Einar Tangen, current affairs commentator, Professor John Gong from University of International Business and Economics, via satellite in Brussels, Daniel Gross, Director of the Center for European Policy Studies, and Professor Steve Keen in Amsterdam with Kingston University. Thank you both for your time. I'm Jonathan Betts. We appreciate you watching Dialogue. Keep it here. There's still much more on CGTN.